Hi everyone, welcome to the pre-course work for week two of the Applying Health Psychology to Patient Care SSC module. It's Thursday of week one as I record this. By now you should have had time to look over the post week one class materials. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you need to do before you come into class next week. We are going to look at individual differences and self-authorship, as it's called. We're going to look at some of the different ways that um, psychology can influence health. And we're going to look at it particularly using this thing called the five-factor model of personality. Okay, so this is the stuff that we know is going to be in this module. This is what we're talking about so far. Last week we talked about biopsychosocial health, and we talked a little bit about CBT in that regard as well. Now we're going to look at this thing called individual differences before we move on to the class, and then moving on into the preparation stuff for week three and your patient interview. This is a really complicated map for looking at how psychology influences health. It comes from the Jane Ogden book. We're going to particularly be looking at some of the different things that influence health in terms of the beginning of the health process. If you look at this map, you look through the middle line, you've got the onset of any illness, you've then got how somebody adapts to an illness, and then you've got the illness outcome as well. We're going to particularly just now focus on some of the psychology stuff that really looks at illness onset. If you remember last week, we spoke about stress. We looked at how the fight or flight response is the basic way of dealing with threat and dealing with problems, and how we as human beings switch this on for things that are not physical threats, but that are psychosocial threats. Unlike most animals that only really switch it on for physical threats. Um, and we know that this is the main way that your psychology affects your health through the kind of conduit of stress. So we might think, well, okay, stress can be a bad thing. Stress can have a big impact long term on your health. So what kind of things might influence stress? Well, there are basically two areas. There's things that are internal to you, and there's things that are external to you. So there is the environment that you're in, and we can all think of environments that may be more stressful than others. Um, this time of year in Scotland, we're all um, dealing with the fact that it's January and it's been quite a while since there's been much in the way of sunlight. And we know that lack of vitamin D, lack of sunlight on a population level can have an impact upon people's mental well-being, mental stress and distress. So that's maybe one of the environmental factors. And we'll come to these type of factors, these environmental factors, in a future session. But at the moment, we're really going to focus on, well, what is it within a person that makes one person more likely to be stressed in a situation than somebody else, and say this is the same situation. You could have two people who are experiencing the same thing. One person is extremely stressed by it and one isn't. What are the kind of differences? Well, the psychology literature on this is called the literature of individual differences. Uh, and what individual differences are is it's basically the study of ways in which one person is different in their behavior and in their internal underlying psychological processes. How what one individual is different from another individual in that way. Uh, Now, what this does is it looks at different classifications of psychology of individual differences. So it tries to say, well, how can we kind of sum up and understand how one person is maybe different from another? There are individual differences that are biological that might have not much to do with psychology at all, such as height. That's an obvious classification. You might classify one person as being 1 meter 3 and another person as being 1 meter 2 and whatever it is. That's I guess a physical individual difference, but there's differences in terms of psychology as well. And it's really important to kind of understand these individual differences. And one of the best ways to do it is to think about understanding yourself. If you can understand your own uh, individual profile, you can kind of understand a little bit about what you are like, and you can understand how that might influence your own well-being, your own stress and distress levels, and then potentially your own health. That can be a bit of a difficult process for people to do because sometimes people don't want to maybe look at their own selves. They don't like to think about the ways in which they themselves might make life difficult for them for themselves, or they might help themselves. Their strengths, their good points. It can be a bit of a difficult process for people, but it's a good process because it can help us to actually understand who we are, and it can help us to be better healthcare professionals, and it can also help us to as well understand the kind of things that patients might be going through as well. Um, People differ in a whole bunch of different ways, obviously. They differ in things like skills and abilities. Lionel Messi is definitely better at, say, football than I am. He's better at vision when it comes to seeing around him and understanding how the space in a football pitch works. That's something that he's got an ability of, which I am not as good at as him. I won't be ashamed to admit that. We can have difference in things like attitudes. One person can find one thing very calming and relaxing, whereas another person would find it very, very stressful. One person finds the idea of sitting on a beach for a week. They find that a great idea and they think that's a great use of their time. To another person, that's an absolute nightmare. That's a different attitude. Um, but one of the big differences is this thing that kind of sits in the middle of this, which is personality. And in some ways, your personality really dictates a lot of your attitudes, values, perceptions, such things. Um, we'll come to what personality is in a minute. We can think about what influences somebody's personality or what influences somebody's attitudes or their values or beliefs or whatever. I guess there's two things here as well. One is hereditary. Hereditary is what occurs as a result of genetic function. We're not totally clear on how psychological variables um, kind of map on to particular genetic expressions, but there definitely does seem to be some genetic component to individual psychological differences. Humans aren't born a blank slate. You're born with certain predispositions. As well as that, there's also obviously environmental factors. So anything that's kind of external to your genes that influence, particularly your development, um, particularly when you're a young child, but not just then, going right up until you're about 25. It takes until you're about 25 um for your brain to be fully mature and fully developed. So during that time, your personality is still relatively flexible, getting a bit less flexible maybe as time goes by. Um, and factors that are environmental can have a big influence on the way that you develop. Um, Relationships are a massive part of this. So close relationships, you might have heard of something called attachment theory. If you haven't heard of attachment theory, you'll be familiar with the idea that the way that we interact with our parents and our main caregivers when we're very young has a big influence on who we turn out to be. Again, it's not the sole factor, but it is a big factor. And that can have a big impact upon the type of personality that we have. Before we really get into this, I'm gonna ask you to think about this first of all, this question, which is why did you want to be a doctor? Uh, Obviously, you've all came to medical school. For some reason, you've ended up here. Why is that? As far as I can tell, it's maybe sort of four reasons why somebody might become a doctor or choose to do medicine. First one is interest. So maybe you found it an interesting area. Maybe your family are doctors, and maybe because of that, you kind of had an interest from a young age, or maybe just from a young age you saw TV programs that had medics in them, or maybe from a young age you were interested in the way the body works, and in biology. So that's fine. That's one reason. Another reason that you might become a doctor is because you think, well, it's a good stable job. There's always going to be doctors needed. They're never really going to go out of fashion. Um, and so, no matter where you kind of go in the world, no matter when you are working, it's probably going to be a need for doctors. So it's a fairly stable job. The other big reason, or the third big reason why people come into medicine is because they say, well, I wanted a job where I'm going to help people. I want a job where at the end of the day, I can put my head on my pillow and say, well, although today was maybe difficult, and although maybe things didn't go well, at least today was worth it because I helped somebody else. That's often for a lot of people a big motivation. And then the fourth motivation that I can think of why people come into medicine is because of the money and the prestige. So in our society, medicine is seen as being the sort of pinnacle of careers. Certainly one of them. Uh, there's a lot of respect involved. It's well paid. There's a lot of prestige, and it means that you can climb a social hierarchy. Uh, None of these reasons are good or bad, by the way. They're all reasonable reasons to come into something like medicine. But you and your colleague next to you might well differ on how and to what extent each one of these different factors motivated you to come into medicine. And that's okay. Now, what likely predicts that answer? What likely predicts why you came into medicine? Well, in terms of the effect of these four variables, well, it's probably your personality. Now, what is personality? I've mentioned that a few times up to now. Fairly simple, fairly straightforward. Personality is enduring patterns of emotions, thoughts, and behavior across time and place. So we think back to last week where we had the five-factor model of CBT, where we had the four internal parts of a person. We had their body, and then we had their subjective experience that's internal to them, their emotions and their thoughts. And then you've got your behavior, which is what other people would see you do, what things you do with your muscles. You think about those four parts of the person, you'll see across time that there are patterns of behavior and there are patterns of thoughts and patterns of emotion. And what we find whenever we look at patterns of thoughts, emotions, and behavior across time, what we find is that personality's basically got um, a five-factor structure. Personality is basically made up of five different things. And regardless of which way you cut it, regardless of what you call it, personality is basically made up of these five things. All psychological tests that measure things like human attributes um, will be measuring either one or more of the five-factor structure, well or badly. They're all essentially measuring the same thing. Now, I'm going to tell you what the five things are in a minute. But before I do that, I'm going to make sure that you understand this thing called the normal distribution. And then now the normal distribution is a way that helps us understand how traits differ amongst a population. Now, what we find is that if we look at things like, say, height in human beings, what we find is that if we were to measure 100 people's height, what we would find is that a lot of people cluster around um, between, say, 5'7" to sort of 6'1", 6'2". If you break that down into males and females, um, men tend to be a little bit taller, so men tend to cluster around 5'9" to 6'2". Women maybe more on the lower end, 5'4", 5'6", 5'7", 5'8", 5'9", round about that. And then you find that so most people are kind of in the middle on a trait like height. What you then find is that there's a few people who are very, very tall, let's say, who are up to the right hand side of the spectrum, and then you get a few people who are very short, and they're to the left hand side of the spectrum. But most people are kind of in the middle. Now, this is how a lot of traits are measured. Things like height are measured like this. Things like IQ are measured like it as well. However, what we also know is that personality is also measured in this is also distributed in the same way. So what we find is that most people kind of cluster around the middle for any personality trait. And when we know that um, some people are very, very high, some people are very, very low on them. but most people kind of cluster around the middle. So, what is the five factor structure of personality? Well, you can remember it using the acronym OCEAN. So, if you think of this as a clock here and you look at the O at the top, O for openness, you can go round clockwise, OCEAN, you get the acronym OCEAN. It's quite a useful way to remember it. Basically, personality has these five structures. I'll explain what they are in a minute, but the first one's called openness, so openness to experience. Second one's called conscientiousness, which is a measure of how likely you are to put off good things now uh, and do hard work now and have good things later. Extroversion, which you might be familiar with that term. Agreeableness, which is how likely you are to put somebody else's needs before your own. And neuroticism, which is essentially the measure of negative emotion. Extroversion people think of as being the measure of how outgoing someone is. It's actually the measure of how likely somebody is to experience positive emotion. So extroversion and neuroticism are the measures of positive and negative emotion. They're different, and you can be high on positive and high on negative emotion. Somebody who's like that would be very dramatic. Everything would be either great or very, very difficult, or nothing's really in the middle. We're going to talk more about these traits in class. But what we're going to do is between now and Monday, I want you to have a little look at your own personality and your own personality model, um, and look at how we can use and understand. And what we will look at in class is how we can use an understanding of your own personality to reduce your own stress. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to go onto Moodle, where you'll find a link to this site. And what this site is it's a five-factor personality survey that gives you a profile of where you are when it comes to your own personality. It gives you an overview of where you would sit um, on each of these scales. If you were somebody who was, say, very, very extroverted, you would score a high score. Say you scored 95. That would mean that in a room of 100 people, you would be in the top. Only five people would be more prone to positive emotion than you. Um, if you scored 3 on, say, conscientiousness, what that means is that in a room of 100 people, only 2 people would be less conscientious than you. Now, no end of any spectrum is right or wrong. In the same way that it's not right or wrong to be tall or short, um, or to have big feet or small feet. Uh, it's there's no correct way to be when it comes to personality, but each personality profile um, is uh, has its own um, presentations of difficulties and strengths. Now, at the moment, you don't have to think about what the difficulties and strengths are, but if you can look at your own personality profile, so go into this website, do the test. It won't take you very long, and then once you've done it, bring the profile that it gives you to class next week. You can bring it on a printed piece of paper if you want. You can bring it on a laptop. You can bring it on your phone. It doesn't matter how you do it, but if you bring the output to class, and we'll talk about it in class. Okay, and I'll see you next week. Any comments or questions that you have, feel free to drop me an email between then and now. Email address is dougie.marks@glasgow.ac.uk. Okay, thanks.